The iron collar gleamed dully in the scorching Wyoming sun as Nathan Cole counted out $100 in gold coins. Everyone thought he was buying a woman, but when he pulled out his knife, she flinched, waiting for violence. Instead, he did something no one expected. He cut the ropes from her wrists and whispered, "You're going to bleed if we don't clean those wounds." That was the moment everything changed. This is the story of how a cowboy buried an iron collar 3 feet deep in the Wyoming earth and built a house over it. Wyoming, November 1915, late afternoon. Nathan Cole sat in his rocking chair on the porch of his log cabin watching the sun sink toward the Rocky Mountains. At 70 years old, his hair had gone white as fresh snow, his hands were gnarled with arthritis, but his hazel eyes remained sharp as the day he'd first ridden into Fort Bridger 43 years ago. His granddaughter Rose sat beside him, 19 years old, with dark auburn hair and blue eyes that reminded him so much of Clara it sometimes took his breath away. She held a notebook and pencil waiting. "Grandfather," Rose said softly, "Grandmother never talked about her life before she met you. She only said her life began the day you cut that collar off." Nathan was silent, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. His hand moved unconsciously to his shirt pocket where he kept an old handkerchief that had belonged to Clara. The fabric was worn thin from decades of being touched, held remembered. "Grandmother's gone now," Rose continued. "But we need to know. Your children, your grandchildren. What happened in 1872? What was she running from? Why did she have that scar around her neck that she never explained?" Nathan drew a long breath. The air was crisp, with the promise of winter carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out. "If I tell you," he said finally, "you have to promise to hear it all. Don't interrupt. Don't judge until I'm finished. Some parts are going to be hard to hear. Some parts I've never told anyone, not even your father." "I promise." Nathan nodded slowly. His eyes softened as he looked back across the decades, seeing not the peaceful ranch before him, but a dusty street in Fort Bridger, a woman in chains, and the choice that had changed everything. "July 1872, he began. "Fort Bridger, Wyoming Territory. I was 27 years old. I'd just received word 5 months before that my sister Emily had died, and I was angrier at the world than I'd ever been in my life." The iron collar gleamed dully in the scorching Wyoming sun, and Nathan Cole wondered if he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life or the only right choice he'd made in years. He stood at the edge of the crowd in Fort Bridger's dusty main street, July 15, 1872. The temperature had reached 98 degrees Fahrenheit by noon, and now at 2:47 in the afternoon, the heat radiated up from the packed earth in visible waves. The woman stood in the center of the street, wrists bound with coarse rope that had rubbed her skin raw and bleeding. She was 21 years old, according to the auctioneer, though the hardness in her blue eyes made her seem ancient. Dark auburn hair hung limp and tangled past her shoulders. The thin cotton dress she wore was stained and torn at the hem, but it was the collar that held Nathan's attention. An iron band 2 inches wide and weighing approximately 4 pounds welded shut around her throat. The metal had worn a permanent indentation into her skin, and when she swallowed, Nathan could see the slight wince of pain the movement caused. The auctioneer, a pot-bellied man with tobacco-stained teeth and a red face slick with sweat, rattled off her supposed qualities like she was livestock. "Strong back, good with cooking and cleaning, young enough to bear children. Healthy teeth, no visible diseases. We'll start the bidding at $50. Nathan felt his jaw clench. 2 months ago he'd stood in a different street in San Francisco asking questions about his sister Emily, asking if anyone had seen an 18-year-old girl with brown hair and green eyes sold to a man heading west. Nobody had seen her. Or if they had, they weren't saying. Emily was gone, vanished into the machinery that devoured young women without families, without protection, without anyone powerful enough to care what happened to them. And here was another woman in that same machinery. The bidding started. $50 from a merchant with greedy eyes, $60 from a rancher whose hands looked like they'd crushed things before, $70 from a man Nathan recognized as owning a saloon 2 streets over. The woman kept her eyes down, refusing to look at the men gathered around her. But Nathan saw her calculating, saw the slight shifts of her weight as she tested the rope binding her wrists. She was looking for escape routes, even though she had to know there were none. The territory had laws about runaway indentured servants. Those laws weren't written to protect women like her. Nathan had come to Fort Bridger to buy supplies: flour, salt, ammunition. He had $143 in gold coins in his saddlebag. That money was supposed to last him through winter pay for the hired hand he needed to help with the cattle, maybe buy a few more head to expand his herd. $100 was 3 months of wages for a working cowboy. It was the difference between a hard winter and a comfortable one. He thought about Emily, thought about the guilt that woke him up at night, the knowledge that he'd failed to protect her when she needed him most. $100. The words left his mouth before he'd fully decided to say them. His voice cut through the crowd like a knife through silk, deep and steady. The crowd parted. The woman looked up at him for the first time. Their eyes met across 15 feet of dusty street, and Nathan saw something in her gaze that hit him like a physical blow. Not hope. She was too experienced for that. But a flicker of desperate curiosity. A question. Who are you, and are you going to be worse than the last one? The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greed. $100 from Nathan Cole. Do I hear 110? The rancher who'd bid 60 shook his head and walked away. The merchant looked angry but stayed silent. $100 was serious money, more than most men would pay for an indentured servant when you could hire a farmhand for $30 a month. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice, sold to Nathan Cole for $100. Nathan stepped forward and counted out the money in gold coins, which the auctioneer snatched eagerly. Then Nathan turned to the woman and pulled a knife from his belt. She flinched instinctively, her body tensing for violence. Every muscle went rigid, her eyes fixed on the blade. But instead of grabbing her or establishing dominance the way every other man who'd purchased her had done, Nathan carefully cut the ropes binding her wrists. "You're going to bleed if we don't clean those wounds," he said quietly, looking at the raw, oozing skin where the rope had cut deep. His voice was surprisingly gentle for a man his size. The woman stared at him, not understanding. Every man who had ever purchased her had immediately made it clear what her purpose was, had taken what they'd paid for. Physical dominance first, rules second, compliance third. But Nathan Cole just stood there, knife in hand, waiting for something she couldn't name. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. In her experience, speaking without permission led to consequences. "My horse is at the livery. We have a 15-mile ride ahead of us." As they walked through Fort Bridger's streets, the woman was acutely aware of the collar around her neck. It rubbed against her skin with every step, a cold metal circle that proclaimed her status to everyone they passed. Women looked at her with pity or disgust, men with curiosity or contempt. She kept her eyes on the ground, following Nathan's bootsteps in the dust, counting them. 347 steps to the livery stable. At the livery he had 2 horses saddled and ready, a large chestnut gelding and a smaller bay mare. He gestured to the bay. "You can ride." "Yes." Her voice came out hoarse from disuse. Thaddeus Crane, the man who'd owned her last, had not allowed her to speak unless spoken to. 6 months of near silence. "Good. It's about 15 miles to my ranch. We should make it before dark." He helped her mount, his hands impersonal and efficient, never lingering, never taking advantage of the proximity. Then he swung up onto his own horse. They rode out of Fort Bridger, heading northeast, and the woman tried to memorize the route in case she needed to run. Past the trading post along the creek north at the large boulder across the meadow. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. Rolling hills covered with sagebrush and wild grass, mountains rising in the distance like sentinels. The sky was so vast it made her feel insignificant, but also somehow free in a way she hadn't felt in years. They rode in silence for over an hour. The woman's mind raced with possibilities, each darker than the last. Maybe Nathan Cole didn't want to establish his ownership in public. Maybe he was taking her somewhere isolated where no one would hear her scream. Maybe he was one of those men who liked to play gentle before showing his true nature. She'd learned that lesson too many times. Finally, as the sun started to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Nathan slowed his horse to a walk. The woman did the same, her muscles tense with anxiety. "That collar," Nathan said without looking at her. "Did Crane put that on you?" The woman's hand went instinctively to her throat. "Yes." "Does it have a lock?" "No. It's welded shut." Nathan was quiet for a moment. She saw his jaw tighten, a muscle jumping beneath the stubble on his cheek. "When we get to the ranch, I'm going to cut it off. I want you to know that ahead of time so you're not frightened when I come at you with metal cutters." The woman's breath caught in her chest. She'd been expecting many things, but not this. "Why?" "Because no human being should wear a collar like a dog." His voice was hard with anger, but she sensed it wasn't directed at her. "Because what Crane did was wrong, and I won't have it on my land." She didn't know what to say to that. Every response that came to mind seemed inadequate or dangerous. Men didn't just remove symbols of ownership. Men reinforced them. So she said nothing, and they continued riding as the sun dipped lower and the air grew cooler. They crested a low hill, and Nathan's ranch appeared below them. A modest spread with a sturdy log cabin, a barn, a corral with several horses, and what looked like good grazing land extending toward a creek lined with cottonwood trees. It wasn't grand, but it looked well maintained and honest. The kind of place built by hard work rather than inherited wealth. As they approached, Nathan spoke again, his voice softer now. "I had a sister. Her name was Emily." The woman looked over at him, surprised by this shift. "She was 2 years younger than me, smart as a whip, beautiful, full of life." He paused, and the woman heard something raw in his voice. "When I was 20 and she was 18, our parents died of cholera. We had no money, no family to take us in." The woman waited, her heart beating faster. She recognized the tone of a confession. "I tried to find work, tried to keep us fed, but it wasn't enough. Emily got a job in a saloon to help make ends meet. I thought that would be fine. I thought I could protect her." His hands tightened on the reins. His horse sensed the tension and tossed its head. The saloon owner started making demands. Said she owed him money for room and board. Before I understood what was happening, he'd sold her contract to a man heading to San Francisco. I tried to stop it. Got into a fight with 3 of the owner's men. They beat me so badly I was unconscious for 2 days. By the time I could stand again, Emily was gone. "What happened to her?" the woman whispered. "I don't know. I searched for 5 years. Went to San Francisco, asked questions, followed every lead. But she disappeared into that world where women vanish and nobody cares enough to look for them. I think she's probably dead. And I think she died believing I abandoned her when she needed me most." The woman felt tears sting her eyes. She blinked them back. "So, when I saw you standing in that street wearing a collar like an animal," Nathan continued, his voice rough with emotion, "I saw Emily, and I knew I couldn't walk away. I had to at least try to save one person, even if I was too late to save my sister." They rode in silence after that. 2 damaged people watching the stars begin to emerge one by one across the vast Wyoming sky. The woman understood now. This wasn't about rescue for the sake of heroism. This was about atonement for a failure that wasn't his fault. This was about a man trying to make sense of a world that had stolen someone he loved. They dismounted in front of the barn. Nathan took both horses to unsaddle and brush down. The woman stood awkwardly, not sure what was expected of her. In her previous situations, the rules had been made brutally clear within the first hour. Here she had no framework to understand what was happening. "You must be hungry," Nathan said as he led the horses into the barn. "There's food in the cabin. Go ahead and eat whatever you want. I'll be in shortly." The woman walked slowly to the cabin, half expecting a trap. But the door opened easily, and inside she found a single large room, stone fireplace, a bed in one corner, table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with supplies, a small kitchen area with a cast iron stove. It was clean and organized, the home of someone who took care of what they had. But she noticed immediately that there was only one bed. Her stomach clenched with familiar dread. She found bread, cheese, and dried meat on the shelves, along with a jar of preserved peaches that made her mouth water. She hadn't eaten since the previous day, and her hands shook as she cut slices of bread and cheese. She was still eating when Nathan came in, carrying metal cutters and a small leather pouch. "Let me see that collar," he said, setting the tools on the table. The woman stopped chewing, her body going rigid. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She'd learned long ago that running only made the punishment worse. Nathan must have seen the fear in her eyes because he held up his hands, palms out. "I'm just going to cut it off. That's all. I promise I'm not going to hurt you." "Men always say that," the woman whispered. Her voice was barely audible. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something like pain cross his face. Real pain, not the pretense of it. "I know," he said quietly, "and I know you have no reason to trust me. But I'm asking you to let me do this one thing. After that, if you want to leave, I'll give you money and a horse, and you can go wherever you want. But I need to get that damned collar off your neck." The woman didn't believe him about letting her leave, but she also knew she had no real choice in the matter. Men like Nathan Cole didn't ask permission. They were just better at pretending. Slowly she approached him and tilted her chin up, exposing the collar. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She could feel her pulse in her throat, right where the metal pressed against her skin. Nathan positioned the metal cutters carefully, his hands steady. His fingers brushed her jaw, and she flinched, but he didn't react to her fear. He just adjusted his grip on the tool. "This might pinch a little, but I'll be as quick as I can. Hold still." The sound of metal shearing through metal was loud in the quiet cabin. Sharp, final. The woman felt pressure against her throat, uncomfortable but not painful. Nathan's face was very close to hers, his brow furrowed in concentration. She could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes, could smell the scent of horse and leather and honest sweat. And then suddenly the collar fell away in two pieces, clattering onto the table with a sound like chains breaking. The absence of weight around her neck was so sudden and strange that she gasped. Her hand flew to her throat to touch bare skin. For 6 months she'd worn that collar, 6 months of cold metal against her skin, of constant reminder that she had no say in her own life, that men like Thaddeus Crane could do whatever they wanted to women who had no family, no protection, no legal standing. And now it was gone. "There," Nathan said quietly. He picked up the severed collar with an expression of disgust, holding it like it might contaminate him. "Wait here." He walked outside. The woman stood frozen, her fingers exploring the indentation the collar had left on her skin, a groove worn into her flesh like the mark of ownership branded onto an animal. She heard the sound of digging. Curious despite herself, she went to the door. In the fading light, she saw Nathan using a shovel to excavate a deep hole near the edge of his property, about 30 feet from the cabin. The hole was already 2 feet deep, and he kept digging, his movements sharp and angry. When the hole was 3 feet deep, he threw the collar pieces into it. They hit the bottom with a dull thunk. Then he shoveled dirt back over them, packing the earth down firmly, as though he were interring something evil that should never see daylight again. The woman felt tears prick her eyes, and she turned away quickly, not wanting him to see. She'd taught herself not to cry years ago when she was 14, and her mother had just died, and the saloon owner was explaining how much money she supposedly owed him. Crying only made men feel more powerful. But the simple act of destroying that collar, of literally burying it deep in the earth, had cracked something in the armor she wore around her heart. When Nathan came back inside, his hands were dirty and his expression was grim. He washed his hands in a bucket of water by the door, scrubbing hard as if trying to remove more than just dirt. "That's done," he said. "You'll never wear anything like that again." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Nathan dried his hands and gestured to the table. "You should finish eating. Then we need to talk about some things." The woman returned to the table, but her appetite had vanished. She watched Nathan warily as he sat down across from her, his large frame making the chair look small. He folded his hands on the table and met her eyes directly. "Here's the situation," he said. "I bought you today because I couldn't stand watching you be sold to men who were going to use you badly. I know that doesn't make me a hero. I still participated in a system that treats human beings like property, and I'm not proud of that. But what's done is done, and now we need to figure out what comes next." The woman said nothing, waiting for the other boot to drop. This was the part where he'd explain what he expected in return for his kindness. This was where the mask would come off. "You can leave if you want," Nathan continued. "I meant what I said. I'll give you money and a horse and supplies, and you can go to California or back east or wherever you think you might have a chance at a decent life." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I'm going to be honest with you. A woman alone on the frontier is vulnerable. You know that better than I do. Even with money, even with a horse, the chances of you making it to safety are small. There are men out there who'd see you as easy prey. And if you got caught as a runaway indentured servant, the law wouldn't be on your side." The woman's throat tightened. She knew he was right. She'd thought about running before many times. The mathematics of survival were brutal. "What's the alternative?" she asked, her voice flat. "You stay here. I need help running this ranch. The work is hard and I can't pay much. But you'd have a roof over your head, food to eat, and I give you my word that I will never touch you in any way you don't want. You'd be an employee, not a slave, not property. A person working for wages." The woman studied his face, looking for the lie. Men always lied about their intentions. They said one thing and did another. They promised safety and delivered violation. But Nathan's hazel eyes were steady and clear, and there was something in the set of his jaw that suggested integrity. She wanted desperately to believe him, but belief was a luxury she couldn't afford. "What kind of work?" she asked cautiously. "Cooking, washing, mending, helping with the animals when needed. General ranch work. It's not easy, but it's honest. I won't ask you to do anything I wouldn't do myself." "And if I stay, where do I sleep?" Nathan gestured to the bed in the corner. "You take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn." "That makes no sense. This is your home. And you're a woman who's been through hell and needs to feel safe. The barn is fine. I've slept in worse places. I spent 2 years sleeping on the ground during the war with nothing but a bedroll and whatever shelter I could find." The woman felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, something that might have been hope if she hadn't learned to kill that emotion long ago. "How do I know you won't change your mind?" she asked. "How do I know you won't come in here one night and take what you think you paid for?" Nathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small revolver. He placed it on the table between them with a solid thunk. The weapon gleamed dully in the lamplight. "You keep this under your pillow," he said. "If I ever do anything that makes you feel unsafe, you shoot me. I'd rather be dead than become the kind of man who forces himself on a woman." The woman stared at the gun. This had to be a test. Obviously, no man would give a woman he'd just purchased a loaded weapon unless he was trying to prove something. But what if it wasn't loaded? What if this was all an elaborate game to make her lower her guard, as though reading her mind? Nathan picked up the revolver, opened the cylinder to show her it was fully loaded with 6 bullets, then set it back down. He pushed it across the table toward her. "It's real, and it's yours. Protection, not a threat." The sun had fully set now, and the cabin was growing dark. Nathan stood and lit an oil lamp, casting warm light across the rough-hewn walls. The shadows danced, making the small space feel both intimate and vast. "You don't have to decide tonight," Nathan said. "Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning." He grabbed a blanket from a chest in the corner and headed for the door. "Bolt this behind me," he said. "Don't open it for anyone, including me, unless you feel safe doing so." And then he was gone, leaving the woman alone in the cabin with a loaded gun and more questions than answers. She heard his footsteps crossing to the barn, heard the barn door creak open and shut, then silence broken only by the sound of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. The woman picked up the revolver with shaking hands. It was heavier than she expected, cold and solid and real. She checked the cylinder again, confirming that all 6 chambers held bullets. The metal smelled of oil and gunpowder. Then she sat in the wooden chair, the gun in her lap, staring at the bolted door. She didn't trust Nathan Cole. Couldn't trust him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Trust was how you got hurt. Trust was how you ended up wearing an iron collar for 6 months. But he had cut off that collar. He had buried it deep, like it was something shameful that needed to be hidden from the world. And that single act had given her something she hadn't felt in 2 years. The faintest possibility that not all men were monsters. She didn't sleep in the bed that night. She sat in the chair with the gun in her lap, watching the door, waiting for Nathan to come back and reveal his true intentions. But the door never opened. The night passed slowly. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of a Wyoming ranch settling in for sleep. Horses shifting in the corral. The soft lowing of cattle in the distance. An owl hooting from somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, the woman finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Nathan Cole had meant what he said. When full daylight came, she heard sounds from the barn. The lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, the general noise of a ranch coming to life. She stood stiffly, her body aching from sitting in the chair all night, every muscle protesting the unusual position. She went to the small mirror hanging on the wall. The face that looked back at her was gaunt and hollow-eyed. Dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. But the indentation around her neck from the collar was already starting to fade, the skin slowly returning to its natural state. She touched it gently, marveling again at the absence of that hated weight. A knock on the door made her jump, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun. "Miss," Nathan's voice came through the door. "I'm going to leave some water by the door for washing. Take your time. I'll be working with the horses if you need anything." The woman waited until she heard his footsteps retreat. Then she unbolted the door and opened it cautiously, the gun held behind her back just in case. Outside sat a bucket of clean water, still cool from the well, and a bar of soap. No tricks, no ambush. Just water and soap left without expectation of thanks or acknowledgement. She brought them inside quickly and bolted the door again. Then she stripped off the filthy dress she'd been wearing for weeks and washed herself thoroughly for the first time in longer than she could remember. The soap smelled like lye and lavender. Harsh, but clean. She scrubbed away layers of dirt and degradation, wishing she could wash away memories as easily. The water in the bucket turned gray, then dark gray, then nearly black. She had no other clothes, so she had to put the same dress back on. But at least her skin was clean. She braided her hair to keep it out of her face, using her fingers to work through the tangles. It took a long time. Some of the knots were so tight she had to break the hair to get them out. When she looked in the mirror again, she looked slightly more human, still tired, still haunted, but clean. She tucked the revolver into the pocket of her dress, feeling its weight against her hip like a promise. Then she took a deep breath and went outside to find Nathan. He was in the corral working with a young horse. The animal was skittish, dancing away whenever Nathan approached. But Nathan was patient and gentle, letting the horse come to him rather than forcing compliance. When the animal finally allowed him to touch its neck, Nathan rewarded it with soft words and a piece of apple from his pocket. The woman watched from the fence, studying him. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew horses, who understood that trust had to be earned, not demanded. There was no anger in his movements when the horse shied away. Just patience and persistence. "You're good with horses," she said. Nathan looked up and his face registered surprise that she'd come out. He hadn't expected her to emerge from the cabin so soon. Maybe he'd thought she'd hide inside all day. "Horses are honest," he said, running his hand along the young horse's neck. "Treat them right and they'll give you everything they have. Treat them wrong and they'll never trust you. There's something pure about that." "Is that why you treat people the same way?" Nathan smiled slightly. It was the first smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and less weathered. "I try. Don't always succeed, but I try." The woman climbed over the fence and approached slowly the way Nathan had approached the horse. careful, testing, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. "I've decided to stay," she said, "for now, but I need some things to be clear." "All right. I do the work you assign and you pay me wages. Real wages that I can save. You don't touch me. You don't come into the cabin without knocking. And if you break any of those rules, I leave. Or I use this." She patted the pocket where the gun rested. "Agreed," Nathan said. He held out his hand. "Do we have a deal?" The woman looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Shaking hands was what partners did, what equals did. She couldn't remember the last time someone had offered to shake her hand like she was a real person with agency and value. Slowly she reached out and clasped his hand. His grip was warm and calloused and firm without being crushing. His palm was rough with the texture of years of hard work. "Deal," she said. Nathan's smile widened slightly. "I should probably know your name, if we're going to be working together." The woman hesitated. Her name felt like the last thing she owned, the last piece of herself that hadn't been taken or sold or violated. Giving it to him felt dangerous, but he'd asked, not demanded. And there was something in his eyes that made her want to trust him, even though trust was terrifying. "Clara," she said finally. "Clara Morgan." "Clara," Nathan repeated as though testing the name. "I'm pleased to meet you, Miss Morgan, and I'm sorry for what you've been through." Clara felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. No one had apologized to her before. No one had acknowledged that what had happened to her was wrong. "Thank you," she whispered. And so Clara Morgan began a new life at the Cole Ranch. The work was hard, just as Nathan had promised. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spent hours cooking over the wood stove, learning to bake bread in the Dutch oven, preserving vegetables from the small garden behind the cabin. She washed clothes in the creek scrubbing until her hands were raw, hanging everything to dry on a line strung between cottonwood trees. She mended torn shirts and pants by lamplight, learning to make neat, tiny stitches that would hold under hard use. But it was honest work, and that made all the difference. When Nathan asked her to do something, it was a request, not a command. When she made mistakes, as she often did in those first weeks, he corrected her with patience rather than anger. And true to his word, he never touched her beyond the occasional accidental brush of hands when passing dishes at mealtime, always accompanied by a quick apology. He slept in the barn, even when the nights grew cold. Clara knew he would be more comfortable in the cabin, but he never suggested it, never hinted that the arrangement should change. She heard him moving around sometimes in the early morning hours, feeding the animals before she had even risen, working himself to exhaustion day after day. She wondered what drove him. What had made him the kind of man who would spend his hard-earned money to buy a woman's freedom when most men would have walked past without a second glance? One evening in late August, after they'd finished supper and were sitting on the porch watching the stars emerge, Clara finally asked him directly, "Why did you really do it? Why did you buy me?" Nathan was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. The crickets sang in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance a coyote howled and another answered. Then Nathan said, "I told you about Emily, my sister." "Yes. What I didn't tell you was how I failed her." His voice was rough with old pain. The saloon owner who sold her contract, his name was Marcus Webb. He made his money selling girls to men heading west. It was a business, very organized, very profitable. Nathan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring out into the darkness. "When I found out what he'd done, I went to confront him. Thought I could buy Emily's contract back or threaten him or do something. But Webb had 3 men working for him. Big men. They beat me unconscious in an alley behind his saloon. Broke 4 of my ribs, shattered my left kneecap. That's why I limp sometimes, especially when it rains." Clara hadn't noticed the limp, but now that he mentioned it, she realized she had seen him favor his right leg occasionally. "By the time I recovered enough to travel," Nathan continued. "Emily had been gone for 3 weeks. The trail was cold. I followed her to San Francisco, but the man who'd bought her contract had already sold it to someone else, and that person had sold it again. The chain went dead after that. No records, No witnesses willing to talk. Just Emily disappeared into a city of thousands. He fell silent, and Clara waited, sensing there was more. "I searched for 5 years," Nathan said finally. "Used every penny I had. Worked odd jobs to pay for food and lodging while I asked questions, followed leads, bribed people for information. And I found nothing. It was like she'd never existed." "I'm so sorry," Clara said softly. 5 months ago in February, I got a letter from a woman in San Francisco who'd known Emily. She said Emily had died of fever that same winter in January of 1872. She'd been working in a brothel trying to earn enough money to buy her way out. The woman said Emily talked about me sometimes, said she knew I'd tried to save her, but she understood why I couldn't. She didn't blame me." Tears ran down Nathan's weathered cheeks, gleaming in the starlight. "But I blame myself," he said. "Every day. Because I should have been smarter, should have been faster, should have done something different. And when I saw you in that street wearing that collar, I saw Emily. I saw every woman who's ever been treated as property instead of a person. And I thought, I can't save my sister, but maybe I can save one person. Maybe that counts for something." Clara felt her own tears falling. For Emily, who she'd never known. For Nathan carrying guilt that wasn't his to carry. For herself, and for all the women like her. Without thinking, she reached over and took Nathan's hand. He looked down at their joined hands in surprise, then up at her face. "It counts," Clara said. "What you did for me counts. Emily would be proud of you." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands under the Wyoming stars, two damaged people finding the smallest bit of comfort in shared grief. That night marked a turning point. Clara didn't bolt the cabin door. She left it unlocked, trusting that Nathan would keep his word. And he did. He slept in the barn as always, never presuming, never pushing for more than she was willing to give. But something had shifted between them. A wall had come down. Not all the walls, not yet, but enough that Clara could begin to imagine a future where she might not always be afraid. The weeks turned into months. September arrived with cooler nights and the first hints of autumn color on the distant mountains. Clara and Nathan worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs, dividing tasks without needing to discuss them. Nathan taught her to ride better, to shoot accurately, to track deer through the sagebrush. He showed her which plants were edible and which were poisonous, where to find water in drought, how to read the weather and the behavior of animals. Clara taught him that food could be more than fuel. She experimented with herbs from the garden, created meals that made Nathan close his eyes with pleasure, baked pies and cakes that reminded him of childhood. They talked in the evenings, sharing stories about their pasts, their dreams for the future. Clara learned that Nathan had been a soldier briefly during the Civil War, fighting for the Union until a leg wound sent him home. He'd used his army pay and years of hard work to buy this land building, everything with his own hands. His dream was simple: to have a ranch large enough to support a family, to live honestly, to never owe anything to anyone. Clara found herself softening toward him in ways that terrified her. She noticed things she'd trained herself not to notice. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the strength in his hands when he worked, the gentleness in his voice when he talked to the animals. She noticed how he always made sure she ate first, how he left wildflowers on the porch sometimes without saying anything, how he respected every boundary she'd set without ever making her feel burdensome. She noticed, and she tried very hard not to care. But caring crept up on her anyway, quiet and insistent as the changing seasons. By September, when the air grew crisp and the aspen trees turned gold on the distant mountains, Clara had to admit to herself that she was developing feelings for Nathan Cole. It was terrifying. Every man she had ever cared about even a little had betrayed that trust. Her mother's lovers, who'd promised to help after her mother died and then disappeared. The first man who'd bought her, who'd seemed kind for exactly 3 days before showing his true nature. Even Thaddeus Crane had been charming at first before the cruelty emerged. But Nathan kept being exactly who he claimed to be: honest, kind, patient, and utterly without expectations of her beyond the work they'd agreed upon. It made her want to trust him, which made her angry at herself for being foolish enough to want such a thing. One evening in early October, a storm rolled in suddenly the way storms did in Wyoming. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, and rain lashed the ranch in cold sheets. Clara was in the cabin preparing supper when lightning struck close enough to rattle the windows. She looked out and saw Nathan in the barn. She knew the barn roof leaked in several places. He would be soaked and freezing all night, and the temperature was supposed to drop near freezing. She made a decision. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and ran out into the rain, getting drenched immediately. The distance from cabin to barn was only 50 feet, but by the time she burst through the barn door, she was soaked to the skin. Nathan looked up in surprise from where he was spreading his bedroll on a pile of hay. "Clara, what are you doing out here? You'll catch your death." "So will you. That roof leaks like a sieve and it's going to be near freezing tonight. You need to come inside." "Clara, we talked about this. You need your space. I need you not to die of pneumonia because you're too stubborn to come in out of the rain." Her voice was sharper than she intended. "I'm not a child, Nathan. I can handle you sleeping on the floor by the fireplace without falling apart." He looked like he might argue, but another crack of lightning made the decision for him. They ran back to the cabin together, both of them laughing despite the cold, despite everything. Once inside, Clara threw him a blanket from the chest. "Get out of those wet clothes before you freeze. I'll turn around." She busied herself at the stove, stirring the stew she'd been making, listening to the rustle of fabric as Nathan changed into dry clothes. When she turned back around, he was wrapped in the blanket, his wet things hanging by the fireplace to dry. His hair was dripping, and he looked younger, somehow vulnerable, in a way she'd never seen him. "Thank you," he said quietly. They ate dinner in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't uncomfortable either, just charged with something neither of them knew how to name. Outside, the storm raged on wind howling around the cabin walls, rain drumming against the roof in a steady rhythm. But inside the cabin was warm and dry and filled with the kind of domestic intimacy that Clara had never experienced before. This was what safety felt like, she realized. This was what it meant to share space with someone who didn't want to hurt you. After dinner, Nathan settled on the floor near the fireplace with his saddle for a pillow. Clara lay in the bed watching the play of firelight on the ceiling, listening to the rain drum against the roof. She knew she should sleep, but her mind wouldn't quiet. She kept thinking about the man lying on the floor, about all the ways he'd proven himself different from every other man she'd known. "Nathan," she said into the darkness. "Yes. Why have you never married?" He was quiet for a moment. "I came close once before the war. Girl named Sarah who lived on a neighboring farm. But when I came back wounded, she'd married someone else. Can't say I blame her. I was angry at first, but looking back, I think she did me a favor. We wanted different things." What did she want? Comfort, security, a husband who'd give her a nice house and pretty dresses and a predictable life. And what did you want? Something else, though I didn't know what at the time. Now I think I wanted partnership. Someone to build a life with, not someone to take care of or control. Someone who wants to be there by choice, not because society or economics forces them. He paused. Maybe that's asking too much. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. "I don't think it's asking too much." She heard him shift on the floor. "What do you want, Clara?" It was the first time he'd asked her that, the first time anyone had asked her what she wanted, as though her desires mattered, as though she had the right to want anything at all. "I want to never be owned again," she said slowly, testing each word. "I want to make my own choices. And I want—" She hesitated, afraid to say it out loud. "What do you want?" Nathan's voice was gentle, encouraging. "I want to know what it feels like to be with someone because I choose to be, not because I have no other option." "That makes sense," Nathan said, and she heard the understanding in his voice. "You deserve that. You deserve all of that." The storm blew itself out overnight, and by morning the world was washed clean and bright. Nathan went back to sleeping in the barn, but something had changed between them. The air felt charged with possibility, and Clara caught herself watching him more often, wondering what it would be like to touch him, not out of obligation, but desire. She tried to push the thoughts away. She wasn't ready. She might never be ready. The damage done to her ran too deep, the scars too permanent. But the thoughts kept coming back insistent as the turning of the seasons. In late October, 3 men rode onto the coal ranch just before sunset. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw them approach, and something about their bearing made her instinctively reach for the revolver she now carried in her apron pocket. These weren't travelers asking for water or directions. These were men with purpose, and that purpose felt dangerous. She walked quickly to where Nathan was repairing fence posts about 100 yards from the cabin. "We have visitors," she said quietly. "They don't look friendly." Nathan straightened his face, growing serious. He glanced toward the approaching riders, then back at Clara. "Go inside and bolt the door. Don't come out unless I call for you." "Nathan, please." "Clara, trust me on this." She wanted to argue, wanted to stand beside him, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She went inside but positioned herself at the window where she could see and hear what was happening. Her hand closed around the revolver, and she made sure it was loaded and ready. The 3 men dismounted in the yard. They were rough-looking, the kind of drifters who made their living on the wrong side of the law. Guns hung low on their hips in the manner of men who knew how to use them. The one in front was tall and broad-shouldered, with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. He looked around the ranch with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating potential loot. "You must be Nathan Cole," the scarred man said. His voice carried clearly in the still evening air. "I am. What can I do for you, gentlemen?" "We hear you bought a woman a few months back in Fort Bridger. Woman with dark hair wearing a collar. That right?" Clara's blood ran cold. They'd come for her. Somehow someone had sent them to retrieve what they considered stolen property. "I bought a woman's contract, yes," Nathan said carefully. His hand moved subtly closer to the rifle leaning against the fence post. "What business is that of yours?" "Thaddeus Crane's nephew thinks you might have taken advantage of his uncle's death to acquire property that should have gone to the family. He wants the woman returned. Says he'll pay you what you spent plus $20 for your trouble. The woman is not for sale." The scarred man's expression hardened. "That's not smart, friend. Jackson Crane is not a man you want to cross. He's got money, got connections, got the law on his side. He says that woman was illegally sold without family consent. Thaddeus Crane had no legal right to own another human being in the first place." Nathan said, his voice cold. "What he did was kidnapping and false imprisonment. The woman stays here." "Maybe you didn't hear me right." The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun. "This is not a negotiation." Nathan's posture shifted subtly, and Clara recognized the stance of someone ready for violence. "Get off my land, now. We'll leave when we have what we came for." Everything happened very fast after that. The scarred man drew his gun, but Nathan was faster. His shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain. The other 2 men went for their weapons. Clara didn't think. She threw open the door and fired twice, her bullets kicking up dirt at the feet of the second man, making him stumble back. "The next one goes through your chest," she shouted, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The gun felt solid in her hands, an extension of her will. "Drop your guns and ride out, or I swear I'll kill you." The 2 uninjured men looked at each other, then at their companion clutching his bleeding shoulder, then at Clara standing in the doorway with a smoking revolver. Whatever they'd expected, it wasn't this. It wasn't a woman who knew how to shoot, who would defend herself, and the man who'd given her freedom. They dropped their guns, hauled their wounded companion onto his horse with rough efficiency, and rode away at a gallop, disappearing into the gathering dusk in a cloud of dust. Clara stood frozen, the revolver shaking in her hands now that the immediate danger had passed. Her heart was racing, her breath coming in short gasps. She'd just shot at men. She could have killed them. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Nathan walked over and gently took the gun from her, setting the safety before handing it back. His hands were steady, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes kept scanning the horizon for more threats. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think so. Are you?" "Yes. Thank you for not staying inside like I asked." "I couldn't let them take me," Clara said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, like it belonged to someone else. "And I couldn't let them hurt you." Nathan looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and admiration, and something deeper she didn't dare name. "We should prepare in case they come back with more men," he said. "Jackson Crane has money and influence. This isn't over." But the men didn't come back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. A week later, Nathan rode into Fort Bridger to gather information. He returned late in the afternoon, his face showing relief mixed with grim satisfaction. "Jackson Crane has been arrested," he told Clara as he unsaddled his horse. "Federal marshals been investigating him for months. Fraud, embezzlement, extortion. Turns out Thaddeus Crane's estate is mired in debt and legal troubles. Jackson was trying to liquidate assets, including humans he considered property, to pay off creditors." Nathan led the horse into the barn, Clara following. "The attempt to reclaim you gave the marshal the evidence he needed. Jackson sent those men to retrieve you illegally. He tried to bribe the auctioneer to falsify records showing you were never sold. When the marshal found out, it was the final piece he needed to make an arrest." Clara sat down heavily on a hay bale, feeling like the ground had shifted under her feet. "So I could leave right now. No one could stop me." "That's right. You're free, Clara, legally and completely. What Thaddeus Crane did to you, putting that collar on you, claiming you as property, it was all illegal from the start. The law just didn't care enough to prosecute until money and political connections got involved." Nathan sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "The world is open to you now," he said softly. "You could go anywhere, be anyone. California back east, wherever you want." Clara looked around the barn at the life she'd built here over the past 4 months. It wasn't the life she would have chosen if she'd been given a choice at 18 or 20 before everything had gone wrong. But now at 21, having survived things that would have broken most people, this life felt precious. This simple ranch, this hard work, this quiet companionship with a man who had proven himself worthy of trust. All of it had value she could not have imagined back when she stood in Fort Bridger Street wearing a collar. "What if I don't want to leave?" she asked quietly. Nathan's face showed a flicker of hope, quickly controlled. "Then you could stay. Not as an employee anymore. As a partner. As someone building this ranch alongside me, sharing in the work and the profits. Equal in everything." "Nathan, I don't know if I can be what you need. I'm broken in ways I don't think I can fix." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd known him, he reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm, gentle, giving her every opportunity to pull away. "You're not broken, Clara. You're scarred. But scars are proof of survival, proof of strength. And I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are. I'm not asking you to be ready for things you're not ready for." His hazel eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm just asking if you'd consider staying, building something here, seeing where this goes between us. However slow you need it to go, however careful. I'm not going anywhere." Clara looked into his eyes and saw no pressure, no expectation of reciprocation, just honest affection and infinite patience. She thought about the collar buried deep in the Wyoming earth. She thought about the gun under her pillow that she hadn't needed to use against him. She thought about the way he said her name like it was something valuable. "I'd like to stay," she said, "but slowly. I need to do this slowly." "As slow as you need," Nathan promised. His hand tightened slightly on hers. "I've waited this long. I can wait longer." The winter of 1872 into 73 was harsh. Snow piled deep and temperatures plunged below zero. Clara and Nathan worked together to keep the ranch running, feeding animals through howling blizzards, breaking ice on water troughs with axes, keeping the cabin warm against the brutal cold. They developed a routine that was domestic and comfortable. And slowly, incrementally, Clara allowed herself to get closer to Nathan. She let him hold her hand sometimes in the evenings when they sat by the fire. She leaned against him when they watched the snow fall. She allowed herself to enjoy the sound of his laughter, rare but genuine, and the warmth of his smile. And one night in January, when the cold was so intense that even the barn was uninhabitable for sleeping, she invited him to sleep in the cabin without any pretense about storms or necessity. "You can take the bed," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. "I'll sleep in the chair." "We could share," Nathan said carefully, watching her face for any sign of fear or discomfort. "Just sleep, nothing else. I'd stay on top of the covers if that makes you feel better. But it's cold, Clara. There's no sense in either of us being uncomfortable when that bed is big enough for two people to sleep respectably." It was a risk. Everything in Clara screamed at her that this was how it started, how the boundaries came down, how the bad things happened. But she was tired of being afraid, tired of letting her past dictate her future, and more than anything, she trusted Nathan Cole. "All right," she said. They lay in the bed that night, a careful space between them, both fully clothed. Clara was so tense she thought she might shatter. Every muscle was coiled tight, ready to fight or flee. Her hand rested on the gun under her pillow, just in case. But Nathan did exactly what he'd promised. He lay still, his breathing slow and even, making no move toward her. The warmth of his body radiated across the small space between them, and gradually, as the hours passed and nothing bad happened, Clara felt herself relax. She moved closer just slightly, just enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. She allowed her hand to rest near his, their fingers almost touching. "Is this all right?" she whispered. "This is perfect," Nathan whispered back. And it was. It was perfect in a way Clara had never experienced. This quiet intimacy without pressure, this sharing of space without demands, this closeness that felt safe instead of threatening. She fell asleep that way, close enough to touch, but not touching safe enough to rest. After that night, they shared the bed regularly. Not every night at first, but often. And Clara found herself healing in ways she hadn't thought possible. Touch became something she could enjoy rather than endure. Closeness became something she could want rather than fear. Spring came to Wyoming with an explosion of wildflowers and new grass. The ranch felt like it was waking from a long sleep. Clara planted a larger garden, putting in seeds for vegetables and herbs, working the soil with her hands, and feeling connected to the earth in a way she never had before. Nathan bought more cattle, expanding the herd. He talked about his plans for the future as though Clara would automatically be part of them, and she found she didn't mind. Found, in fact, that she wanted to be part of those plans. One evening in May, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara turned to Nathan and said the words she'd been holding inside for weeks. "I think I'm ready." Nathan looked at her, waiting, not pushing, never pushing. Ready for what? Ready to be with you, really be with you. Not because I have to, not because I owe you anything, but because I want to. Because I love you. The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile. Clara's heart raced. She'd never said those words to anyone before. Never felt them. Never believed she could. Nathan looked at her with wonder, as though she'd given him something more valuable than gold. "Are you sure there's no rush, Clara? I can wait as long as you need." "I'm sure. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Nathan stood and held out his hand. Clara took it. They walked inside the cabin together, and for the first time in her life, Clara experienced intimacy as something beautiful. Nathan was patient and gentle, constantly checking to make sure she was comfortable, letting her set the pace and the boundaries. His hands were careful, reverent. He treated her body like something precious, something to be cherished rather than used, and when she cried afterward, he held her and understood that they were tears of release, tears of grief for everything she had lost, and joy for what she had found, tears for the girl she had been, who had believed love was impossible, and the woman she was becoming, who was learning to believe again. "I love you too," he said into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I've loved you since the day I saw you standing in that street, refusing to let them break your spirit. I will love you for the rest of my life." They were married in Fort Bridger on a bright day in June of 1873. The ceremony was brief, attended by a few local friends. Old Jack the blacksmith was there, tears in his eyes as he watched Clara walk down the aisle without a collar around her neck. Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher who'd befriended Clara, stood as witness. Clara wore a simple blue dress that she'd sewn herself. Nathan wore his best suit, which was still worn and patched but clean. When the preacher asked if they took each other as husband and wife, Clara's voice was strong and clear. "I do." She was choosing this man, this life, this future, and that choice felt like reclaiming herself, like taking back everything that had been stolen from her. Their life together was not easy. The ranch demanded constant work. There were hard years when cattle prices dropped or the weather was bad, but they faced everything together, true partners in every sense. Clara discovered she had a talent for managing the ranch's finances. She kept meticulous records, made smart decisions about when to buy and sell, negotiated better prices with buyers who initially tried to dismiss her because she was a woman. Nathan learned that having someone to share the burden made even the hardest work bearable. In the spring of 1875, Clara realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complex mixture of joy and terror. She had never thought she would have children, had never believed she would find someone she trusted enough to create a family with. But as her belly grew and Nathan fussed over her with protective concern, she found herself excited about the future in a way she had never allowed herself to be. Their son was born in December of 1875, a healthy baby boy with Nathan's hazel eyes and Clara's dark hair. They named him Samuel after Nathan's father, and Clara fell in love with her child in a way that was almost painful. Holding Samuel, she understood viscerally what it meant to want to protect someone, to give everything you had to ensure their safety and happiness. She understood why Nathan had searched for Emily for 5 years. Love made you willing to do impossible things. Nathan was a devoted father, taking turns walking Samuel when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, talking to the baby in a soft voice that made Clara's heart ache with love. Watching him with their son, she marveled at how different he was from every man she had known before. His strength was in his gentleness, his power in his restraint. 2 years later, in 1877, their daughter arrived. A tiny girl they named Elizabeth, after Emily, Nathan's lost sister. She had Clara's blue eyes and stubborn chin. Samuel, now 2 years old, was a doting older brother, carefully bringing his baby sister toys and patting her head with toddler enthusiasm. The years passed in the way they do when life is full of purpose and love. The children grew, the ranch prospered. Nathan and Clara built something real and lasting. But on a cold November day in 1878, 6 years after Clara had first come to the ranch, a rider arrived with news that would test everything they'd built. Jackson Crane was out of prison, and he was coming for Clara. The rider was Deputy Morgan, the same man who had sided with Jackson Crane 6 years ago, but had switched allegiances when he realized the extent of Crane's corruption. He dismounted quickly, his face grave. "Nathan, Clara," he said, nodding to them both. "I rode out here as fast as I could. Jackson Crane got out of prison 3 days ago. Sentence reduced for good behavior and political connections. And he's been asking questions about you." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. Samuel, now 3 years old, was playing at her feet. Baby Elizabeth slept in a cradle nearby. The life she'd built, the peace she'd found, suddenly felt fragile as glass. "What kind of questions?" Nathan asked, his hand moving instinctively to Clara's shoulder. "Where you live, whether Clara's still here, whether you have children." Deputy Morgan looked uncomfortable. "He's telling people he has unfinished business, that you stole property that belonged to his family, and he means to set things right." "I'm not property," Clara said, her voice sharp. "The law confirmed that 6 years ago." "I know that, ma'am. You know that. But Jackson Crane has a way of twisting the law to suit his purposes. He's hired a lawyer, a man named Father Dominic." Nathan's expression darkened. "The priest? The one who testified against women in morality trials?" "The same. Crane's claiming you coerced Clara, that she wasn't of sound mind to make decisions when you bought her contract, that the marriage isn't legal because she was still under obligation to the Crane family." "That's insane," Clara said. I chose to stay. I chose to marry Nathan." "I believe you, ma'am. But Father Dominic is very persuasive. He's convinced the territorial judge to hold a hearing. You'll have to appear and testify about the circumstances of your acquisition." The word hung in the air like a curse. Acquisition, as though Clara were livestock. "When?" Nathan asked. 2 weeks, November 30th at the courthouse in Fort Bridger. After Deputy Morgan left, Clara and Nathan sat in silence. Samuel had gone down for a nap. Elizabeth slept peacefully. The cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire. "We'll fight this," Nathan said finally. "We'll get a lawyer, gather witnesses. Old Jack saw Crane put that collar on you. Sarah Mitchell can testify about your state of mind when you arrived here. We'll prove that everything we did was legal and right." "And if we lose," Clara's voice was barely a whisper, "we won't lose. But if we do, Jackson Crane could take everything. He could claim I'm still bound to his family, that our marriage is invalid, that the children are—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Nathan pulled her close. "That will never happen. I will die before I let him take you or our children." Clara believed him, but she also knew that death was sometimes what men like Jackson Crane wanted. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Nathan rode to Fort Bridger 3 times to meet with a lawyer, a young man named Thomas Wright, who specialized in contract law. Clara wrote down everything she remembered about Thaddeus Crane, about the collar, about the 6 months she'd worn it. The memories made her physically ill, but she forced herself to document every detail. Old Jack agreed to testify. So did Sarah Mitchell. So did the auctioneer who'd sold Clara, though he was reluctant and clearly worried about legal consequences for his part in the transaction. Deputy Morgan promised to testify about Jackson Crane's character, about the fraud and embezzlement that had sent him to prison in the first place. But Father Dominic was gathering his own witnesses. Women who claimed Clara had been a prostitute in San Francisco. Men who swore they'd seen her soliciting. People who testified that women like Clara couldn't be trusted to make their own decisions, that she needed the guidance and protection of a good Christian family like the Cranes. November 30th arrived cold and clear. Clara and Nathan left the children with Sarah Mitchell and rode to Fort Bridger. The courthouse was packed. News of the case had spread, and it seemed like half the territory had come to watch. Jackson Crane sat at the plaintiff's table looking prosperous and righteous in an expensive suit. He was 35 now, his dark hair slicked back his face, showing the soft edges of a man who'd never done hard physical labor. Father Dominic sat beside him, dressed in clerical robes, his expression one of pious concern. Clara felt their eyes on her as she took her seat, judging, measuring, finding her wanting. The judge was a man named Harlan Pierce, 60 years old, with a reputation for fairness, but also for strict interpretation of the law. He called the court to order, and Father Dominic rose to make his opening statement. "Your Honor, this is a simple case of theft disguised as charity. Nathan Cole took advantage of a vulnerable woman in a moment of crisis. Clara Morgan, then Clara Brennan, as she was known in San Francisco, was not of sound mind when Mr. Cole purchased her contract. She was traumatized, confused, unable to make rational decisions about her own welfare." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. She'd never been called Clara Brennan. That was a lie, a fabrication to make her seem connected to Thaddeus Crane's family. "The contract Mr. Cole purchased was fraudulent," Father Dominic continued. "Thaddeus Crane never had legal authority to sell Miss Brennan. She was in his care as a ward of his family, a position of trust that Mr. Cole exploited. We ask the court to void the marriage, return Miss Brennan to the care of the Crane family, where she can receive proper Christian guidance, and award damages to Mr. Jackson Crane for the theft of family property." Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to stand up and tell everyone what Thaddeus Crane had really done, how he'd treated her, what the collar had felt like around her neck day after day. But their lawyer, Thomas Wright, had coached her. "Wait your turn. Stay calm. Let the evidence speak." Father Dominic called his first witness, a woman named Martha Hayes, who claimed to have known Clara in San Francisco. She testified that Clara had worked as a prostitute, that she'd been involved with criminals, that she couldn't be trusted. During cross-examination, Thomas Wright established that Martha Hayes had never actually met Clara, that she was describing a different woman entirely, and that Jackson Crane had paid her $50 to testify. Judge Pierce struck her testimony from the record. The next witness was a man who claimed to have seen Nathan Cole coerce Clara into signing marriage papers. But under questioning, he admitted he'd never been to Wyoming, had never met either Nathan or Clara, and was testifying based on what Jackson Crane had told him. Strike 2 for Father Dominic. Then Clara was called to testify. She walked to the witness stand on trembling legs. Her hands shook as she placed them on the Bible to swear her oath. She looked out at the crowded courtroom and saw Nathan's face steady and encouraging. Thomas Wright asked her to tell her story, to start at the beginning and tell the truth. So she did. She told them about her mother dying when she was 14, about the saloon owner who'd claimed she owed him money, about being sold to the merchant in San Francisco who'd beaten her, about the gambler who'd won her in a card game and kept her locked in a room for 6 months. She told them about Thaddeus Crane, about the collar he'd welded onto her neck when she tried to run, about the 6 months she wore it, about the pain and humiliation and constant reminder that she was considered property rather than a person. Her voice shook as she described standing in Fort Bridger's main street, being auctioned like livestock. But it grew stronger as she described Nathan cutting the ropes from her wrists, Nathan asking, not commanding, Nathan cutting off the collar and burying it like it was something evil. "Did Mr. Cole force you to stay at his ranch?" Thomas Wright asked. "No, he gave me a choice. Leave with money and a horse or stay and work for wages. He gave me a gun to protect myself. He slept in the barn so I would feel safe." "Did he force you to marry him?" "No. I chose to marry him. I love him. He's the first man who ever treated me like a human being instead of property." Father Dominic rose for cross-examination. His smile was cold. "Miss Brennan, or should I say Mrs. Cole, isn't it true that you had nowhere else to go, that you married Mr. Cole out of desperation rather than love?" "No, I married him because I love him." "But you were damaged goods, weren't you? Used up. No other man would have wanted you. Mr. Cole took advantage of that." Clara felt anger surge through her, burning away the fear. "Nathan Cole gave me freedom when I had none. He gave me choice when I'd never had it. He gave me respect and dignity and love. The only men who ever took advantage of me were men like Thaddeus Crane. Men like you, Father Dominic, who hide behind religion while judging women for circumstances beyond their control." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Pierce banged his gavel. "And this collar," Father Dominic said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You claim Mr. Thaddeus Crane welded an iron collar onto your neck, yet I see no such collar now. How convenient that the only evidence of this supposed abuse has disappeared." Thomas Wright stood quickly. "Your Honor, we have a witness who saw the collar being applied and who can testify to its existence." "Call your witness." Old Jack took the stand. He was 70 now, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his mind was sharp and his memory clear. "I was Thaddeus Crane's blacksmith," he said. "January of 1872, he brought that girl into my shop, told me to put a collar on her. I told him it was wrong, but he insisted, threatened to fire me if I didn't do it." Jack's voice broke. "I put that collar on her. I can still hear her screaming. I've regretted it every day since. It was 2 inches wide, made of iron welded shut. She wore it for 6 months until Nathan Cole cut it off." "And where is this collar now?" Father Dominic asked. "Nathan buried it, dug a hole 3 feet deep and buried it like you'd bury a body. I saw him do it." "How very convenient." No physical evidence, just the word of 2 people who clearly have reason to support each other's stories. But Thomas Wright was ready. "Your Honor, we'd like to call a medical witness, Dr. Samuel Brennan from Fort Bridger." The doctor took the stand and testified that he'd examined Clara 2 years ago when Elizabeth was born. He'd noted in his medical records a permanent scar around her neck, consistent with prolonged wearing of a heavy metal collar. The scar tissue showed evidence of friction and weight, exactly what would be expected from months of constant pressure. "The scar is permanent," Dr. Brennan said. "It will never fully fade. Mrs. Cole will carry that mark for the rest of her life." Father Dominic had no response to that. Physical evidence documented in medical records 2 years before this trial, before anyone knew Jackson Crane would be released from prison. Jackson Crane himself was called to testify. He claimed his uncle had been a kind and generous man, that Clara must have misunderstood his intentions, that she was clearly unstable and needed the care of family. Under cross-examination, Thomas Wright asked about the embezzlement that had sent Jackson to prison, about the fraud, about the other women whose contracts he'd tried to claim as family property to sell them. Jackson's composure cracked. He began shouting about his rights, about how ungrateful Clara was, about how women like her needed to be controlled for their own good. Judge Pierce called a recess. They reconvened 2 hours later. The courtroom was even more packed than before, people standing along the walls craning to see. Judge Pierce looked tired as he took his seat. He shuffled through papers, his expression grave. "I've reviewed the evidence," he said, "and I've considered the arguments from both sides. This case requires me to balance legal precedent against basic human decency, and I find the law in this area to be profoundly lacking." Clara held her breath. "The evidence is clear that Thaddeus Crane treated Clara Morgan in a manner that violates every principle of human dignity. While indentured servitude was legal at the time, placing an iron collar on a human being crosses the line into slavery, which has been illegal since 1865. He looked directly at Jackson Crane. "Mr. Crane, your uncle's actions were criminal. You have no legal claim to Mrs. Cole, nor have you ever had such a claim. The contract Nathan Cole purchased was fraudulent from the start, but that fraud lay with your uncle, not with Mr. Cole." Relief flooded through Clara like water breaking through a dam. "Furthermore," Judge Pierce continued, "I find that Mrs. Cole married Nathan Cole of her own free will in full possession of her faculties, and that their marriage is legal and binding. The children born of this marriage are legitimate. Mr. Jackson Crane's claims are denied in their entirety." The judge banged his gavel. "Case dismissed." The courtroom erupted in cheers and shouts. Father Dominic gathered his papers with a furious expression. Jackson Crane stood abruptly, his face red with rage. "This isn't over," he shouted at Clara. "You think you've won. You're nothing but a whore who got lucky. You'll always be damaged goods, and everyone knows it." Nathan moved faster than Clara had ever seen him move. He crossed the courtroom in 3 strides and hit Jackson Crane with a right hook that sent him sprawling. "You will never speak to my wife that way again," Nathan said, his voice deadly calm. "You will never come near her or our children. If I see you anywhere near my ranch, I will kill you. That's not a threat. That's a promise." Deputy Morgan stepped between them before Jackson could retaliate. "Mr. Crane, I suggest you leave town, tonight, and don't come back." Jackson Crane left Fort Bridger that evening. According to reports, he moved to San Francisco and died 3 years later from alcohol poisoning. Clara never thought about him again. They rode home in silence, Clara's hand in Nathan's. When they crested the hill and saw the ranch below them, their cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, Sarah Mitchell playing with the children in the yard, Clara felt something inside her finally let go. She was free, completely irrevocably free, not just legally, but in her heart. Jackson Crane had been the last thread connecting her to her past, and now even that was severed. "Thank you," she said to Nathan. "For what?" "For everything. For seeing me as a person when everyone else saw property. For giving me choice. For loving me." Nathan stopped his horse and pulled her close. "Loving you was the easiest thing I ever did." They celebrated their victory quietly, just the 2 of them and the children. Samuel didn't understand what had happened, but he sensed his parents' joy and laughed along with them. Elizabeth gurgled happily in Clara's arms. That night, after the children were asleep, Nathan and Clara stood on the porch watching the stars. "I want to build something," Nathan said suddenly. "What?" "A bigger house. The ranch is doing well. We can afford it. A proper 2-story house with bedrooms for the children, a kitchen that's not cramped and dark." Clara smiled. "That sounds wonderful, but I want to build it in a specific place." Nathan took her hand and led her to the spot where he'd buried the collar 6 years ago. The ground looked like any other patch of earth grass growing thick and green. "Here," he said. "I want to build the new house right here, right over the place where we buried the worst part of your past. So every day when you walk through your home, you're literally standing on ground that represents your freedom and your choice." Clara looked at him with tears in her eyes. After 6 years of marriage, he could still surprise her with gestures that showed how deeply he understood her. "That's perfect," she said. "Let's build our future exactly there." The house went up over the summer of 1880. A beautiful structure with glass windows that let in light, a wide porch perfect for watching Wyoming's dramatic sunsets, and bedrooms for each child. Samuel and Elizabeth ran through the rooms, their laughter echoing off the walls. Clara stood in the kitchen of the new house, running her hand along the smooth wooden countertop, and thought about the girl who had stood in Fort Bridger's street wearing a collar, believing she had no future worth living. That girl could never have imagined this joy, this belonging, this profound sense of home. In 1883, they had another son, a sturdy boy they named Thomas, who inherited his mother's fierce independence and his father's patient temperament. Their family felt complete. 3 children who would grow up knowing they were loved and wanted, who would never experience the helplessness and degradation their mother had endured. As the years passed, Clara became a respected figure in Fort Bridger and the surrounding ranches. She helped other women when she could, offering work to those who needed it, standing up against men who thought money gave them ownership. She never talked publicly about her own past, but people knew. The way people always knew things in small communities. And rather than looking down on her, they respected her resilience and her refusal to be defined by what had been done to her. Nathan's hair started going gray at the temples in his late 30s. Clara discovered her own silver threads in her early 30s. They laughed about growing old together, about the lines forming on their faces from years of hard work and laughter. Samuel grew into a tall, serious young man who wanted to study law. In 1890, at 15, he left for university back east, determined to become a lawyer who fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Clara cried as she watched him board the train, but they were proud tears. Her son would do good work in the world. He'd been raised by parents who understood the importance of justice and compassion. Elizabeth followed 4 years later, heading to a women's college in Colorado to study medicine. She was bright and curious, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. She would make an excellent doctor. Thomas stayed on the ranch, taking over more of the daily operations as Nathan's joints began to ache from decades of hard physical labor. At 19, he married a sensible young woman named Margaret, who loved the ranching life as much as he did. Nathan and Clara became grandparents in 1896 when Thomas and Margaret had a daughter named Rose. Holding her first grandchild, Clara marveled at the impossible distance she had traveled from that terrible day in Fort Bridger 24 years earlier. The baby in her arms was free, loved, wanted, protected. That was legacy. That was victory. Samuel had married a fellow lawyer and had twin boys. Elizabeth had married a doctor and had a daughter. Thomas and Margaret had 2 children now, Rose, who was 2 years old, and a baby son born just 3 months before. Samuel had married a fellow lawyer and had twin boys. Elizabeth had married a doctor and had a daughter. The house rang with noise and laughter, 3 generations of Coles filling the space with life and love. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was finally quiet, Clara and Nathan sat on the porch they had sat on countless times before. She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, and looked out at the land they had built together. "Nathan," Clara said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Yes." "Do you remember the day you cut off that collar?" Nathan looked at her, and in the starlight she could see the emotions play across his weathered face. "Every detail. I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever seen, standing there terrified, but refusing to break." "I remember thinking you were probably lying," Clara said softly. "That you'd turn out to be just like the others. What made you decide to trust me?" "You buried the collar deep," Clara said. "You didn't just throw it away. You buried it like it was something evil that needed to be put down permanently. That's when I started to believe you might actually be different." Nathan pulled her closer. "Best $100 I ever spent." Clara smiled despite her tears. "I was never worth $100. You were worth everything I had," Nathan said. "You still are." Wyoming. November 1915. Late afternoon growing dark. Nathan sat in his rocking chair, his 70-year-old hands folded in his lap, his eyes distant with memory. Rose sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as he finished his story. "And that's how it happened," Nathan said quietly. "That's how I met your grandmother. That's what she survived and what we built together." Rose wiped her eyes. "I had no idea. Grandmother never said anything about the collar about being sold. She didn't like to talk about it, but she wanted you to know eventually. That's why she made me promise to tell you the story after she was gone. She wanted you to understand that no matter how dark things seem, no matter how broken you feel, you can survive. You can heal. You can build something beautiful." "Where is it?" Rose asked suddenly. "The place where you buried the collar." Nathan smiled. "You're sitting on it, the porch, the foundation of this house. We built everything right over that spot. Your grandmother walked over it every day for 25 years. She used to say it reminded her that she'd conquered her past, that she was standing on top of it instead of being buried by it." Rose looked down at the wooden planks beneath her feet, understanding the symbolism. "She loved you so much," Nathan said. "She talked about you constantly, about all her grandchildren. She was so proud of the family we'd built, the legacy we were leaving. I wish I'd known her story while she was alive. I would have told her how brave she was. She knew, and she was brave, Rose, braver than anyone I ever met. She survived things that would have destroyed most people, and she came through it with her capacity for love intact. That's true strength." Nathan stood slowly, his joints protesting. Rose stood with him, taking his arm to steady him. "Your grandmother died in September," Nathan said, his voice soft with grief. "She was 64 years old. It was peaceful. She went to sleep one night beside me and she didn't wake up. The doctor said it was her heart. But I think she just felt like her work was done. She'd lived to see all 3 children grown, married, happy. She'd held her grandchildren. She used to tell me that every day after we won that trial was a gift she never expected to receive." His voice cracked. "We had 42 years together, from 1873 to 1915. Not long enough. It's never long enough." "Your grandmother's been gone 2 months now," Nathan said, "and I miss her every single day, but I don't regret a moment of our life together. From the day I cut that collar off to the day she died in my arms, loving her was the greatest honor of my life." They walked inside together. Rose helped Nathan settle into his chair by the fire. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full of memories of love, of the life that Clara and Nathan had built together. The next morning, Rose found Nathan in his chair. He had died peacefully in his sleep, a smile on his face, and Clara's old handkerchief clutched in his hand. At the funeral, Rose told the story her grandfather had shared. She told it to her siblings and cousins, to the community that had known and loved Clara and Nathan Cole. She told it so that no one would forget what they had survived, what they had built, what they had meant to each other. And she made sure that every generation of Coles that came after would know the story of the iron collar, of a woman who refused to be broken, of a man who chose to see her humanity when everyone else saw property, of a love built on respect and choice rather than ownership and control. The house still stands today, built over the ground where Nathan buried that collar in 1872. 5 generations of Coles have walked its floors, lived in its rooms, grown up, hearing the story of their great-great-grandmother who wore an iron collar and the great-great-grandfather who cut it off. The collar itself rusts in the Wyoming earth, 3 feet down, forgotten by time but not by history. Above it, life continues. Children play. Families gather. Love endures. And somewhere in that ground beneath the foundation of a house built on freedom lies the symbol of everything Clara Morgan Cole overcame. Buried deep, hidden forever. defeated by the simple power of one man choosing to see another human being's worth and one woman finding the courage to believe she deserved better. The cowboy cut off her collar and buried it deep. But what he really gave her was something far more valuable: the chance to discover who she could be when she was no longer defined by what men had made her. And she became someone extraordinary, not despite her scars, but because of them, not in spite of her past, but informed by it, shaped by it, and ultimately transcendent over it. Their love story was not about rescue. It was about partnership, about two damaged people choosing to build something beautiful together. And as the Wyoming stars wheel overhead, as they have for 150 years, the legacy of Clara and Nathan Cole endures. She had been owned, but she reclaimed herself. She had worn a collar, but she broke free. And in the end, that freedom built on love and respect and mutual choice was worth more than all the gold in the territories.